Hello, I'm that Simon Fanshawe. The panelists you can see are Emma Codd, who's the Global Inclusion Leader at Deloitte, Jenny Hibbert, who's the Global Managing Partner at the Financial Services Practice of Heidrick and Struggles, Louisa Morton, who is a partner in their Global Employee and Change Communications Practice at Finsbury, and Sarah Jenkins, who's the Managing Director of Saatchi & Saatchi London. I've already talked to them before, and I can tell you they're interesting, really interesting, and they're also fun, so that'll be a laugh. Now look, how we explore change in the culture. Before we talk about that, let's talk about this notion of inclusion. I did a session recently on an inclusive leadership conference, and somebody wrote to me afterwards, one of our clients, and they said, I think some people may have been thinking inclusion is nice and pink and fluffy. Actually, it seems to me as though it's anything but. I started to think during your session that on the contrary, it's where all the muck and bullets are. The role of the manager is to manage that as positively as possible. And the reason that she said that, I think, is that I was really arguing that inclusion is not about sameness, it's about difference. Because here's the news story, all black people don't think the same, all gay people don't think the same, all women don't think the same. Those groups experience discrimination as a group, even though that will vary in its impact. And even so, they all know the effect of what I always call the fist in the face moment, but all of those groups of people will contain within them different views, different opinions, different life experiences, and different backgrounds. But the trouble, I think, with inclusion and the way it's talked about is that too often those groups are assumed to have a single experience. So people talk about the black, the BAME community in our business or whatever. But quite clearly, if you look at the narrative of black and brown voices around Black Lives Matter, there's a huge variety of views about where race sits as an interpretive angle on life and their relationship towards race and change. If you look at the arguments around trans issues and gay issues and feminist issues, you'll see there's a huge variety of opinion amongst those groups of people. So inclusion's not a kind of coerced consensus, it's much more about dynamic discussion. I always say that safe spaces are spaces that are safe for discussion and disagreement, not from discussion and disagreement. And the great challenge for managers is to hold the ring on those difficult discussions. As W.E.B. Du Bois said, the great black American intellectual and founder of the NAACP, he said in The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, we want to be co-workers in the kingdom of culture. So what we're going to have a chance to discuss is how we become the co-workers in that kingdom of culture, and how we can really define inclusion as something much more difficult than the kind of fluffy being nice to people. So I wanted to ask questions to each one of the panelists, give them a chance to share with you their perspective on this. And Louisa, I was going to ask you to start with how you leverage true inclusion and difference in order to create better ideas, better strategies, better ways forward.
Yeah, it's a great question. And actually, I think what it really speaks to is the fact that if organisations want to move forward, they ought to have a pretty good reason of why, almost the business case for it, because I think that then helps drive greater change. So, if you think about inclusion and equity, and I love your point about pink and fluffy, because in my view, it has to, if it's true and it's meaningful, it has to hurt a little. Margaret Heffernan summed it up brilliantly yesterday when she said, no one wants to say that there's a cost. So, the example she gave was, we'll bring in women, of course we will, and it's fine and nothing will change. Well, if you bring in different people, it will change. So I think what we need to get comfortable with is good, because that's why we brought in different people, because we wanted change. And if we think about inclusion and equity, I really see those as levers for the current recovery, both our social recovery, but also the economic recovery. We need all the ideas, we need all the perspectives. Why on earth would we exclude a large percentage of thinkers and activators and doers? and hand over the thinking to a homogenous group when what we need right now is change. I saw an engineer speak years ago at the Women's Forum in Deauville, and she put it absolutely brilliantly. You know, why do we need more women? Well, why on earth would we exclude 50% of the available talents? And I think that's a great way to think of it.
Thank you. Emma, I mean, just picking up on that idea of cost and Louisa's point, echoing Margaret Heffernan, what is the cost to the organisation of trying to create some rules which nonetheless encompass that broad variety of difference within the organisation?
Look, I from my perspective, I have long been frustrated, I think, about a lack of progress within organisations. And when you look at, certainly in my view, when you look at why that's happened, I think it's because organisations have sort of done a light version frequently, which does not cost very much. So, let's have a few fix the person programs. Oh, women don't have confidence, so let's put a program in place and to fix that. And actually, the reality is what we're talking about here is a need to, in my view, to fix the culture, the organisational structures that have, come into place, and that can be costly. I mean, you are looking at your DNA of your organisation, the way that we operate. It can come down to, to resetting in terms of behaviours. My big thing and my big passion is about what I call everyday culture, and it's how do our people feel? We have in the UK 18,000 people globally, over 300,000. How does every one of those people feel when they walk into the building, virtual building or otherwise? How are they spoken to? Are they respected or disrespected? And it's not just about doing a training course on unconscious bias. This is about an entire structural reform. This is about looking at your pain points, listening to your people. And I loved the session yesterday with Kwame and others, and some of the messages in there, which is, create a safe space, as you've said, listen. But honestly, my view is be prepared to act. And by acting, you are invariably going to be taking difficult decisions. But know that if you don't do that, the cost to your business, frankly, of not doing something is more significant than the cost of taking action and doing what you need to.
Quick follow-up. What's the most costly decision you've made around those questions of culture? Not you necessarily, but the organisation.
Well, I think, from our perspective, we'd embarked on a huge culture change program, which I was really proud of leading alongside our CEO from 2014 to 2019. We put people through, various sessions. We had our pain points that we started addressing, and then we had the culture side of it. Now, it was, as you may have read on the front page of the FT, we exited, some senior leaders. And I think that shows an organisation that has been really serious about this and about dealing with everyday culture. And when you are willing to actually take a bold move to do something. So the reality is it's those sorts of things, but they absolutely need to happen.
And just a quick side point on that. We're talking about cost, but I prefer to use the language of investment.
Yeah. I agree.
Yes.
What's the investment we're making here? And it pivots immediately into a positive act rather than a negative act.
I think that's right. But again, back to some of the comments this morning about honesty, there's a value, I think, in recognising. And as Louisa was saying, there is this kind of, it's the pink and fluffy notion that somehow actually change doesn't come at a cost of change, if you see what I mean. And so it is an investment ultimately, but there are, eggs and omelettes and other such cliches. And Sarah, just to follow this through a bit, and slightly relating to my point about seeing these groups as if they have a single experience, one of the things that organisations need to do to understand the difference in the organisation is they need to collect reliable data. In other words, they have to have a reliable base to understand what's going on in the organisation. And I know that's something that you're concerned about, but also you've got some ideas about how you do that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, data is an imperative. We cannot move forward if we don't know what the actual problem is and where the gaps and challenges are. So for anyone on any stage of their D&I journey, you've got to make sure there's a base level of data. And in order to get that base level of data in truth, you've got to ask your employee and your talent base the question, and that it has to be self-completed. The HR team, the HR department can't collect the data. It has to be an individual choosing to share their ethnicity, identity, their sexuality. All that stuff comes from asking the question. And if you want a high response rate, and if you want to have an honest response, you need to make sure you're creating a culture of trust and transparency around that data.
And one of the things that the firms do, which I think is faulty, is that individual experience gets averaged out. In other words, they do collect data as if these groups of people have similar experiences. And one of the things that we do a lot of is not just collecting numerical, but collecting subjective sort of actual text, verbatim responses, so you can get into the texture of the language. And the other thing is collecting data about ambition, because just because, if women or people of colour don't necessarily rise up, well, you have to understand whether everybody's not rising up, and you also have to understand questions of ambition, don't you, as to whether actually it's ambition that's being blocked or people are happy where they are. And those these are much more complex questions.
Yeah. It's definitely nuanced, but I think we're all working in businesses where we're getting better and better at asking the right question when it comes to data for our clients or for our own organizations. We just need to apply that really smart data lens to the capture of data around diversity. And I think we'll accelerate really quickly. And one of the questions that we ask in our engagement survey is, would you recommend this organization to somebody of your ethnicity? So that's a great data point for us to keep tracking moving forward. And obviously there's no reason why we don't open that up to have the same conversation around sexuality, social mobility, to make sure we are genuinely building a place where people feel that they belong. And it's what a great metric you would have to recommend your organisation.
One point I would add, sorry, Sarah, I didn't mean to talk over you, but it's in terms of encouraging people to share their data. It's not just about getting people to understand the trust and integrity with which that data will be used, but also the purpose to which it will be used, because I think people are much more forthcoming and honest in their responses if they understand that ultimately that data will be used for the greater good and to move the dial. Typically, it comes back to this point, which I imagine we'll touch on more, about being intentional. But I think purpose as well as trust plays a key role here.
I remember doing a little tiny bit of work with one of the retailers in their distribution, and they'd done one of those surveys, and they said to people, are you this, are you that, are you the next thing? And all the lorry drivers were going, who wants to know if I'm gay? And actually they were a bit affronted, really, and they were thinking, well, it's, go away. So eventually I said, what do we do about this? Because no one asked the question. So I said, well, you have to write back to them and say, some people don't have a great time in the organisation. We want to make sure they do. Kind of people who don't always have a great time are often gay. So if you're gay, tell us. And they all went, oh, all right then. Well, I'm straight or gay or whatever, Jenny, you're a headhunter, Hydrogen Struggles. And one of the things that strikes me about the difficulty of the relationship you have with your clients is that actually you might well be a lot further ahead of them in these discussions than your clients are. On the other hand, you don't want to lose the business. So how do you deal with, because my experience of headhunters is often that, they're variable in their responses to the client's demands. Some push very hard back and some don't. So how do you, when we, again, talking about this inclusive culture, if headhunting means anything, it means helping clients to recruit difference and recruit more inclusively. So how do you do that?
I think it's a great question. And I think you're right. I think there's a difference between how some headhunters approach this topic. With some being more intentional than others. I would put Hydrogen Struggles, and I would absolutely put the financial services practice, which I lead, into the highly intentional bucket.
And we're proud,
yeah, we're proud to be so, indeed. And we walk the walk, as you say, as a female, and I'm the first female of the financial services practice. I'm not the only female that leads one of our major practices. We actually, as a management committee, have a 60% diversity overviews. So I think we are quite intentional, but the client point, Simon, is a great one. The way in which we see it is we actually see ourselves as being change agents in terms of supporting our clients to be intentionally inclusive. One of the things that I listened to on yesterday's session, and I love the phrase, was about sort of creating interdependent cultures. And I think that's what we try to respectfully hold our clients' feet to the fire on. And then it becomes self-perpetuating. And what I mean by that is I think clients seek us out when they don't want to be let off the hook, when they want to be uncompromising when it comes to diversity and inclusion. I think if you don't want to do that, then you might opt to work for a different headhunter. I mean, to give you an example, and it's one of many, but of how I think this plays out really well. I've personally been working with a major international insurer on 2 big hires. Our direct client is a female CEO, and she is passionate about creating a sustainable creating and sustaining an inclusive culture. So she opted to work with Hydra for Struggles. Actually, at the start of the search, our approach was what I would call textbook or traditional. And what I mean by that is, we mapped the appropriate candidate universe. We identified a broad suite of talent. But it was always against her very, very clear expectations at the start of the process that the slates for both appointments would be majority diverse. So not just 50-50, but majority diverse.
Can I pursue with you all this idea about difference, though? Because one of the things that I think, and you can actually see it in the American election, although I don't like to spend too much time worrying about what they're worrying about. But one of the things that worries me deeply at the moment is the degree to which groups of people in businesses, the so-called, protected characteristics of the minority groups or whatever, or minority status groups, are being gate-kept. In other words, there's a set of views that are ascribed to people. The pronouns one is a classic, where people think it's a nice gesture, but actually there's a whole group of women particularly who don't feel that they have the need to, because they don't believe that they have a gender identity separate from their sex. So if what you do is by doing something nice, because that's thought to be the right opinion, you're then imposing on a bunch of people something they don't want to do. Whereas actually what we ought to be doing is discussing between those groups of people what's a way forward for everybody. So, and that seems to me to be true inclusion, but we do seem to have a real problem with that at the moment. And I wonder whether each one of you could talk about, A, how you perceive that, and secondly, how you deal with it. Louisa, you were nodding forcefully there, so let's start with you.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And want to pick up on a word that you used there, which is conversation. And it came through in the discussion yesterday. I think Claudia talked about working with a CEO who was curious, courageous, and caring. And for me, it's the curiosity point that is absolutely key. So, if I think about kind of how sort of post George Floyd, how we've all come to this. Matthew Taylor talked yesterday, and I love this phraseology because I recognised it in myself, which was walking around with my own complacency. And this idea that, of course, you think you're a right-thinking person and you're liberal and you think of others, but actually the truth is we've been looking at other people's lived experiences through the lens of our own. And when I think about sort of when have I had the moments, the sort of penny drop moments, those are typically where I've been able to have some kind of experience. Kwame talked about the power of theatre, and I think it would be easy to sort of say, oh, it's a bit of a stretch, or how's that relevant? But actually, when I was sort of preparing for this, when I thought about when were the penny drop moments, they were having a moment, having time to sit back and listen to somebody else's perspective, not with my own lens, not thinking about, oh gosh, yes, a really similar thing happened to me a couple of years ago, just being quiet and listening to a different perspective. Really fantastic places like Wilderness in the book tent, listening to people talking about their books. So I think there is two things. One is about quiet moments where you just stop, you find the time to listen to someone else's perspectives. But then the next build on that is conversations. And I think that's one of the things that changed over the course of the summer. Matthew talked about the RSA had a go at it and they realised they got it wrong and they went again. I think a lot of organisations went through the same thing. They realised the apology wasn't enough and they had to do the hard work and have conversations.
And that listening, though, Sarah, has to be to as much to the individual, isn't it? My sort of little kind of journey at the moment is to listen to hear, not listen to respond. So and I have a very personal approach to this in the sense that my husband's black. And so that's a huge challenge because it changes the way I think about and see, issues of race. But he doesn't, for instance, share a lot of the views about using race as the single lens through which to look at an experience, for instance. And this is true of lots. Women don't all think the same news story. So, Sarah, how do you, as a manager, hold the ring on what can be very personal and difficult discussions in order to make them productive?
Oh, yeah, it's such a great question. And as Louisa just taught, the importance of having conversations and understanding at as a most individual level as you can. But I generally take a step back, and I certainly say this to my leadership peers and when I am talking to senior clients, because there's a lot of paralysis going around at the moment. Like, I'm afraid of doing the wrong thing. I don't even know where to start. And I do think for all of us, none of us are fully knowledgeable. So I think there's a humility that we all need to bring to this conversation and this subject matter. There is a need to be empathetic and to really begin to lean into these different experiences. Curiosity is really important, and action. It's those 4 pillars that we've got to be doing. And if we're doing those 4 things and constantly investing our time to be more curious and constantly investing our time to create action, we've got time to have those conversations. We've got time to listen. We've got time to read. And then it becomes osmosis. We're just doing it all the time. It doesn't have to be a learnt act. But hate to repeat my previous panelists, but as many conversations as we can possibly have, break out of our bubbles and our friendship groups as well. Really, really think about socially and professionally who we're spending time with.
I mean, Emma, that's an interesting question that both Louise and Sarah raised, which is the amount of time that we should take. And in a sense, having those conversations. I was very struck. There's a wonderful article I read some years back by a scientist called Yuri Alon. It's a brilliant article. He works at the Weizmann Institute, and he talks about how he runs his lab. And one of the things they do in their weekly meeting is at the beginning of the meeting, they spend half an hour talking about stuff. Because they're all scientists and they like talking about what they did at the weekend, and they think that's work. And to them, it's really important. And I wonder how, in a business where there's kind of action, and here we are on Zoom, and where are all those other chats happening, how do we create that time really to be curious and caring and curious, really to listen? How do we do that?
There's 2 ways. There's, I suppose, part of your everyday existence, which, these days can feel quite frenetic and non-stop Zooms. And, what I do, for example, with my team is we have a team call and we spend the first 15 minutes talking about our lives or, what's going on, and people just listening. But I do think in order for that to happen, you need trust. And I think it was Matthew Said was talking, in his book about, you can have a team that looks very diverse on paper, but actually, unless there's somebody that is creating a sort of trusting culture, then, people aren't going to, people need to be empowered to speak up. The other thing I would say is I'm a huge fan, this came up again yesterday, I'm a huge fan of storytelling. And we actually, when we embarked on our culture change journey, which was, back in 2014, 2015, we did force it. We forced people into a room. It seems very alien now, but physically in a room, groups of 20 peers. And then we did play some stories. We played some really tough stories, and they were not by protected characteristic. They were by stuff that's happened. They were by, what we call microaggressions, everyday behaviors. And we forced people to listen to that. And we didn't give them anywhere to look. You could look at your colleague or the floor. And it was amazing to see that response of 17 minutes of it being pushed at you. And then we just left the rest of the time for people to actually open up and talk about how they felt. And so, so I think it's, you're going right the way through, that journey of enabling people, getting them together and making them listen. And I absolutely agree. I'm a woman, but I'm a sum of so many parts. And I hate being characterized as, in this one characteristic. So I think it's getting people together, getting that atmosphere of trust, and then building it into your everyday actions. But you can only do that if you are a trusted leader. I really believe that.
And I think you've got to show some of that vulnerability yourself, obviously, haven't you, in order to create that part of that trust. I remember talking to somebody, a terrific army officer that I know, and he was talking about what it's like to be at the gate of the compound in Helmand. And I said to him, well, how do you inspire the troops with trust, but also share their fear? And that balance, and it struck me that was a very extreme version of leadership. And I know I've just written a book, and it's called The Power of Difference, and it will be available, obviously, in all good bookshops in June. But one of the things I was thinking about was, why do I think these things that I think? And part of the reason I think the things that I think about diversity and inclusion is that, I had to spend a lot of time in my life working out how a posh middle class boy, manages to find his place in social and organisational change. And you can't just go on and say, oh, I'm gay, you know, who cares? Do you know what I mean? It's not a passport change. And I think that is really important, as people working out their individual position in relation to the change they want. So I was just thinking there, Jenny, that if what it's about is understanding difference and creating the space to have difference. I mean, again, going back to the headhunter thing, it seems to me that what people do, and one of the things that stops inclusion, is the preconceptions about who they want. So what they obviously want the same, but they express it in lots of different ways. So what one's got to create in boards and senior execs, which is obviously where you are, and reflecting on RBS, for instance. One of the interesting things about that disastrous takeover attempt of ABN AMRO and so on and so forth was that no one ever discussed whether they should do the deal. They only ever discuss the detail. So how do you create at a very senior level that respect for difference? And a little bit about what was being talked about earlier, which was the I don't know factor, the ability to acknowledge your own vulnerability.
Yeah, I think, again, it comes back to what I shared at the start, Simon, which was around sort of explaining the context and the why. You know, actually, I think for the most part, we are now working with leaders and clients who are enlightened as to the power of doubt, you know, the power of not assuming that you know all of the answers, and really importantly, the power of inclusion. I think some of the challenges that we encounter in supporting clients in that is at some point in a search process or in a consulting process, the need for action or the need for results comes through and derails the good intention to actually follow through and get to a consensus-led decision. I mean, if I actually go back to the client I was talking about before, the female CEO at the helm of an insurer, what she's done really, really well in partnership with us is continue to drive a consensus-led process. She didn't let herself off the hook in terms of going for the short win. And she said to us up front, she said, please don't let me off the hook. And we didn't. So we've pulled her back a few times and we've said, actually, you know, just because it's feeling awkward, just because you're hitting pockets of resistance, which you do, you know, keep true to running a consensus-led approach, because what that means is everyone buys into the end result. And it may not be what they thought they wanted, but because they've all had the chance to buy in through the process, there's acceptance. And that acceptance is so important for that candidate's success, because recruiting the diverse hire, and I hope no one really needs me to say this, but that's the starting point. It's not the end point, it's the starting point. You know,
well, certainly if there's
then the journey of getting them comfortable and setting them up for success. But if you have a consensus-led process in the first instance, that means that people feel ownership, people feel sponsorship, people feel that they are personally, to use Sarah's word, invested in the success of the individual and the organization.
Right.
Everyone's set up to try and make that work.
Okay, so we're beginning to construct something that says, actually, we have to understand difference. And we also crucially have to understand difference, not just in terms of that group experience, which is real, but in the way in which individual experience is different within and between groups and so on and so forth. So we have to collect data that understands the group experience. We have to understand the individual experience and the level of ambition. So we have to have an understanding, so that's the data point. We then have to construct spaces where people can have these discussions and exchange and see that as work. In other words, value each other's difference and understand how we can rely on each other's difference to create bigger outcomes. So if we're doing all that and we really are valuing difference, and we're seeing the value of it in commercial terms, if you like, or in corporate terms, when we say we want to include everybody's voices, I'm paraphrasing Ian Thompson's question here on the Q&A, but are there any voices that you feel legitimately that you can and should exclude in a business? Sarah, I mean, he said specifically, can there be place for, in an inclusive organisation, for people who have an entrenched and vocal racist, sexist and other perspectives?
Absolutely not, because I think there will be ethics and a code of conduct that any organisation would have and holds true, where you can't hold those that prejudiced views. That doesn't mean that we should be leaving behind people who are on a journey, and some people very early on a journey of working through why diversity and inclusion is going to benefit everyone. But it does require an organisation to be prioritising resource and investment and cost towards certain communities and certain individuals. So for me, it's pretty binary. There's no space for those voices, but there has to be energy and time spent on people who are at the start of the journey.
Okay, so let me come back on a second question to that. There's two groups of people there. Who gets to say whether something is racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic? Because what's happening at the moment is those labels are being chucked at people, but actually because they disagree with a particular angle on a topic or a subject, rather than they're actually racist. So you've got this very difficult problem, haven't you, between intention, effect, and who gets to gatekeep the meaning of those words. So how do organisations deal with that very difficult question, Sarah?
Yeah, that's great. And obviously the steroid injection that diversity and inclusion got in June after the killing of George Floyd, we've been having these conversations far more than we ever had them before. And it's about leadership, making sure that they are clear on what those boundaries are and on what's expected. But you've got to be having conversations with people from those communities and those individuals and understanding, which no one in leadership is able to do alone, and understand where are the challenging areas and the problem areas and what is acceptable and what's not.
So Louisa, where does the organisation draw that? Or no, not where. How does the organisation draw that line? The people on a journey. I mean, you can see it in democratic Republican politics, can't you? I mean, the Democrats, for all they've might manage to have done, they haven't won over a whole bunch of people. I mean, I'm not prepared to believe that 68 million Americans are all kind of thoroughgoing sort of white supremacists, whatever. It just seems unfeasible. So how do you go about that process, as Sarah is saying, of embracing those people who are on a journey, saying to some people, it's not you, but that behaviour is unacceptable? How do you do that?
It's a really great question. I think I've made a decision that I'm not going to try and do an analogy with US politics at the moment.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I gave in. You're right to tell me.
But listen, I think it is really difficult. And I think I sort of have, I guess maybe because I work in engagement, I have this long held theory that sometimes when we walk in the door of an office virtually now, we sort of leave our humanity at the door and we kind of think of ourselves as robots. You know, the messaging is driven by logic and strategy. We kind of, we wouldn't typically show our emotions. So I think a big part of this comes to the point Sarah made about a kind of culture of trust and what the leaders are saying and doing. Hearing a leader say, do you know, a junior person just called me up on this. And actually, when I thought it over, I really understood where they came from. So I think it's about safe spaces, but it's also about how do you avoid being adversarial? Because we all know what it's like when someone wags the finger or sounds like they're ticking you off. You can get to this sort of very adversarial position. I think data can do that. Sometimes you get the data and you go to a manager and go, well, your data looks terrible. And over there, your peer is doing much better. Well, instantly, we've created this kind of defensive position. So it's about how do you just create an atmosphere where people can present an alternative view. Now, to Sarah's point, there are some people who don't want to go on the journey and they will make themselves evident. And I think then it's easier to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff. But there's definitely something about environment and there's definitely something about humanity, the way in which you approach it. Humans aren't tick boxes. So what do you do to help people through that? And the final point I just wanted to make, because it picks up on a lot of what we're talking about, is all of this is a journey. So Emma, you keep re-emphasizing, you started your culture journey in 2014. And I think we all have to accept, and I think that's one of the things that George Floyd and this kind of the businesses coming back for a second bite at their recognition and apology is we've just realized we can't hop in a helicopter and get there tomorrow. Actually, there's going to be some hard graft over time before we get there.
Emma, does it help listening to those answers? I was thinking perhaps it helps to stop thinking of people as racists or sexists or homophobes, but thinking about the things that something they have done as being sexist, racist or homophobic. In other words, once we start to reject the whole person rather than actually tackle their views, then we get, and that's your point about, in a sense, we're not robots. Actually, we have views and they do change. So do you think that helps us at all, Emma? And has that, in your experience over this 6 years, has trying to talk about behaviours rather than types of people, does that help?
Yeah, I mean, look, look, I think linking into values does, as long as your people believe that you live your values. I mean, we've all got a set of values, and they probably all sound very similar. And then it's the proof of the pudding as to actually, and I think it was Sarah that said, it's walking the talk, and so to get that environment where people feel able to speak up. I think there is a big difference, as we all know, between somebody unintentionally making a comment. Now we know that is wrong, and effectively most microaggressions are unintentional. The big issue for me is people trusting that if they raise that, because it's one thing saying, well, we'll deal with it, but honestly, in my early career, and actually in my mid-career, where if I had comments made to me, I would go through a big internal deliberation as to, do I raise it? Because actually I was really worried about career penalty. And I think that's still the big issue here is, getting people to, to actually feel able to speak up in the knowledge that the organisation will do the right thing. And whether that is something as dramatic as an exit, or whether it is actually, enabling further conversation. But I think that's something that also is critical here. And I do, I would encourage, conversation, safe spaces again. But I would say, if you don't have that trust, it's all very well listening, act on it. And if you don't have that trust, just know that people aren't going to speak up. So you won't be aware of some of these things that are going on there.
It seems to me
sorry, Simon, I was just going to add one thing that I don't think we've touched on listening to all that I think is really important in all of this is creating a culture of feedback. Because as you've just said, Emma, a lot of these comments, they're actually not intentional, a lot of these microaggressions. Now, when they are raised, knowing that someone will have gone through the deliberations, as you say, as a line manager, as a leader, you have to listen, you have to act, you have to make sure nothing's swept under the carpet. But I think there's also a process of education for everyone, which is, in the first instance, I'm going to go back to that individual who made said comment and explain and give them feedback and give them the chance to learn. I mean, actually, back to Louisa's point, which I think is incredibly well made, launching quickly into a very strict intervention, which can feel adversarial, isn't actually going to enable the journey for the long term. There will be moments where you have to be heavy-handed, but I think creating a culture where everyone feels that they can raise things, but then everyone will also get feedback about what was raised, how it was raised, and so on, I think is absolutely critical on this journey.
And can we ban the phrase zero tolerance? You know what I mean? Because, you hear it at schools. I had a head teacher that said, we've got zero tolerance towards bullying. And I was like, well, it's not a very useful thing to say, but actually, that implies you don't think there's bullying in your school. Well, it turns out you're an idiot. Of course there's bullying. It's a sort of given. And I'm wondering how so that's one thing, which is another thing to take away is not the confrontational intervention or this kind of heavy-handed outlawing, but much more back to curiosity and listening about intention and effect. Adam, my husband, and I had a discussion the other day about the phrase, where do you come from? So he's Nigerian and he learned his English off the telly. So he speaks with a voice that's got a hint of American in it. And people never know where he comes from. So they're always asking where he comes from. And it doesn't occur to him that it's an odd question. So we've had lots of discussions and we've been testing it out with friends as to what they respond, how they respond. Sarah, sorry to use you as an example here, but that's a difficult one, isn't it? Because sometimes I might want to know, you have a voice actually which has a tinge of American in it too. So I might want to say to you, where do you come from? But there are a number of black people who would say, actually, that's a very offensive question. And it's in that level that if that is allowed to fester, that can be very unproductive, can't it?
Yeah, definitely. And although I think we're all on this panel with some very sort of clear points of view, but there's no doubt there are a lot of bear pits and lots of sort of traps along the way. And I think we just have to all bear in mind there are times we're going to get it wrong. You've got to be building a culture of trust, and you've got to be the type of person that you're building relationships with people. So it probably shouldn't be the first thing you ask of somebody, but over time, of course, you can work at the right time to ask that question and to be curious. You have a license to be curious as long as you've shown humility and empathy along the way. It's almost like working through those layers and to make sure you've got permission to really then start digging deep with people.
That's interesting. Sorry, I'm just writing something down. The license to be curious is, I think that's a really interesting.
Oh, that made me sound really clever, didn't it? I inadvertently said something smart there, didn't I?
Well, I don't know. Was it inadvertent?
Inadvertent.
It came over to me as a beautifully curated and previously cooked, beautiful thought. And just one thing, the word nuance has been used a couple of times here. I must share with you my favourite tweet, I think, of the decade, which is somebody tweeted the other day, there should be more nuance on Twitter, yes or no. Which I think goes down as kind of one of the great wit things on Twitter. So look, we're talking about license to be curious. People are bringing up a number of questions around these things. There's a number of comments, actually, rather than questions about these things. So one of the things, there's a couple of themes that I'd like to ask you. You are all senior women, and you have been through that rise in your careers. And so you have a recollection of what it's like to be a junior woman. But to some extent, you now have a great deal of status in your organisations as partners and so on. How much does that changed you in a way? And how much do you have to, or what permission do you give yourselves to think about what your impact now is, given the sort of the power that you've got? I mean, in a sense, you've become, you're upper class in business terms now, aren't you all? So, I mean, Louisa, how do you think carefully about the fact that you are now powerful, that when you're the boss, you walk into the room, other things happen, and so on and so forth? How do you raise that question with yourself?
What a great existential question. Half the time I probably still hide under the bed with imposter syndrome. I think part of it is I've always felt slightly uncompromising, and absolutely I've had some struggles along the way. I've had some very kind of strange requests and requirements through work where I think I'm not sure you would be asking a male counterpart to do or accept or be the same thing. But I have felt quite uncompromising, and I think that's helped. And I've thought, well, do you know what, if that didn't work out, it didn't work out on my terms. But one of the things that I try to do now is think about what are the things that I can do to help. And I know it all sounds like Matthew talked about woke jargon, but the concept of sponsoring rather than mentoring. So, when someone new joins the organisation, what can I do to make their path a little easier? Deborah Frances-White spoke at this conference a couple of years ago, and she used this absolutely extraordinary analogy of the corridor and this kind of difference between the people who sort of stroll up the corridor and think it was difficult versus the people smashing through windows and trying to kick down doors along the way. So I often think about what can I do to open doors. So I might just, with somebody new and junior, set up a series of introductions with people that they might not have the kind of guts to go and approach, for example, and check in. So I'll often think, what was a struggle for me, and how could I help somebody else just not go through that one again? But also in terms of a lot of the pro bono work we do is around sort of youth. So where I also spend that spare energy.
Thank you very much. We're getting to the end, so quickly, Sarah, how do you check?
I love every question, Simon. I love the fact that now, as a senior woman and actually a member of leadership, that I can make public my organisation's commitments. And that is one of the most powerful things you can do, is to tell your clients and tell the industry what you're doing, because then you said, that's it, that's my goal, that's what I'm aiming for. So it's both a carrot and a stick, and it's very handy, making public our commitment.
Thank you. Emma?
Oh, I agree with both Louisa and Sarah. I think the other two things for me are not to lose my authenticity. I'm often told I'm an authentic leader, and back to what we were talking about, do you know what? Sometimes life sucks, and sometimes you have to be open about it. We all have, ridiculous challenges that we face. So it's sharing those and being open about those and human. And then the other big rule I live by, which I hope people that know me would agree with, is I always pay it forward. I absolutely do not want people to go through some of what I went through. So if I can make it better, I will.
Fantastic. And lastly, Jenny?
Look, I agree with so much of what's been said, actually. And just to Emma's point, there's a big bit of, it's almost the New Zealand All Blacks analogy of sort of passing the jersey on. I feel a huge commitment to do it. And I think just touching briefly on the tangibles, in my seat, I've tried to hire, promote, enable the success of a lot of diverse talent, and actually, going beyond simply opening doors and creating opportunity for them. Right. I've actually personally asked to be formally measured.
Thank you.
Success, so that they see my investment in them, and I am judged on it as well as they are.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you. I knew this would be a good conversation. Allow difference, allow debate, allow that time for curious, for the license to be curious. It's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed for coming down amongst the mud and the bullets. And I don't think there was a single cliche throughout the whole 3/4 of an hour. So well done, gang. Thank you very much indeed for the panel. And back to you, Adam.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you, panel. This represents tumultuous applause from Auckland to Abu Dhabi to Anchorage. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Pleasure to have you all. That was fascinating.